Hey, 10 o'clock. So good to see you. Hey, can we just take a minute to thank Ethan and the band? That was awesome. I love that. So cool. I grew up a church rat. You know what I mean? Like a gym rat. Somebody's always in the gym. I was always at church. I grew up, my dad was a preacher for a little while. And we were at church all the time, and I remember life in the village that I grew up in, man, it got pretty flat. It could be pretty boring, but you knew when you went to church, anything could happen. It was awesome. You didn't know once the ivories started to be tickled and the organs started to thump, man, that was the energy that just sort of pulsed through the community for the week. And I don't know about you, I'm still a church rat. I love coming to church. I love coming and gathering around a mysterious God together and just seeing what could happen. And I love those songs. I love when we do the songs that I know. I love when we do the songs like we just did that I don't really know. And just coming and singing those and declaring truth over one another. It's just beautiful. It's just good. So, and it's good to see you, by the way. We're in the middle of a series in case you're new with us or you're just kind of checking church out or coming back to church for the first time in a long time. We are in the middle of a series on the Book of Ecclesiastes, and it's an interesting book. We've said this week in and week out because it's not really preaching. It's ranting. It's not really giving you answers. It's really asking you questions. And there's a reason for this. The author of this book, Solomon's doing this for a very specific reason. He's trying to show you that there are two paths to life. There's either life, what he calls under the sun. There's the created world, and assume this is all there is. And if that's true, he comes to this conclusion, nothing matters. Or on the other side of the coin, there is a God who has created all things. And if that's true, everything matters. And there really is no middle ground. That's the conclusion Solomon comes to. And depending on when you read this book or what age or stage of life you read this book, I meet a lot of people who stopped me in the community these last couple of weeks who've said, this is my favorite book. Many people say that because it resonates. There's something in it. It's raw. It's honest. Herman Melville, the great American author in the 19th century, he said, the Book of Ecclesiastes is the truest of all books. It's the truest of all books. Herman Melville was the author of Moby Dick, several other classics. In fact, the story of Moby Dick, if you've never read Ecclesiastes, but you read Moby Dick somewhere along the way in school, or maybe you just read the Cliff Notes so you could take the test. Moby Dick, wouldn't it be nice if church worked that way? But you're all here. Moby Dick was a story that really, Melville's honest about this. He wrote it to echo the themes of Ecclesiastes. Captain Ahab, the grizzled old captain, is symbolic for Melville of Solomon. And what is Ahab doing? He's searching for the white whale. He's looking for this mysterious force, this white whale that's out there. He's on a hunt while everyone else is sort of turned away. And that's Solomon, because the white whale is God in the story of Moby Dick. And he's searching. That's what Solomon's doing. He's searching for God. And he's inviting you, he's inviting me on this search for the white whale, for God, to know, to see the hand of God at work, the uncreated God at work here in this created world. And he's using something interesting to do it. He's using philosophy. And we don't do a lot of philosophy in the modern world. If I said to you, well, I'm a philosopher, you would say, well, you're unemployed. That's what that means right there. We don't do philosophy. If you showed up to work tomorrow, you showed up to a dinner and you started waxing philosophically about a topic, everyone, shut up. If you showed up to work, if you work at AT&T and you walked in and you said, you went Jerry Maguire on everybody, what is the purpose of these cell phones anyway? And nobody wants to hear that. We don't do philosophy in the way that we used to in the world. We don't think in philosophical terms. It's boring. What's the purpose? What's the point? It's troubling at a certain level. Several years ago, I had a friend who his son grew up in the church, and he called me, and his son was a freshman in college. He moved away, and he said, I need you to sit down with my son. I'm worried about him. I said, why? Is it drugs, partying? He said, no, it's worse. He changed his major from business to philosophy. What is he going to do with that? What's the purpose? we don't think highly of philosophy, and yet in this book, that's exactly what Solomon is doing. He's pressing us to think philosophically. Stephen Hawking, the famous late scientist, said in 2011 that philosophy is dead, that science has killed philosophy. In other words, this world is all there is. This cold, sterile universe is all we get, and there's no real reason to sit around thinking about what's the meaning of life. There's not any. Science, interesting, that statement Hawking made is actually a philosophical statement, but it's this idea, what's the purpose of thinking about things at that deep of a level? Just live your life. Carl Sagan, the late astrophysicist, he had a program on PBS called The Cosmos. Anyone remember this? I knew it. All the smart people come to 10 o'clock. You did know. The cosmos. He began every episode of the cosmos the same way. He declared the cosmos, some of you remember this, the cosmos is all there is, all that ever was, and all that ever will be. And he went on to explain the nature, or at least what we could understand, of the cosmos. And what you have, this is what's so fascinating about the Book of Ecclesiastes. Solomon says to Sagan, he says to Hawking, deal, let's assume the cosmos is all there is. This world under the sun is all that ever has been and all that ever will be. And he follows that to make it a little too honest today, to its end. He says, look, if you're going to assume that, as most people in the modern world do, that's what's so fascinating about this book. It was written 2,700 years ago, but I agree with Melville. There's not a book more well-positioned to engage our current culture as this particular book, because he says, look, if you assume that this is all there is, then we have to follow that to the logical end. And so he does that. And so what we're doing week in and week out here is we're sort of following the rabbit trail of despair that Solomon goes on. This week it has to do with justice and beauty. And then he comes out of it. And so if you're new with us, it gets a little dark here for a few moments, but don't worry, it turns around. So if you have a Bible, turn with me to Ecclesiastes chapter 1. Starting in verse 1. If you don't have a Bible, you can download the CRB app, or you can follow along on the screens. That's okay too. Ecclesiastes chapter 1, starting in verse 1. This is the teacher, is what Solomon calls himself. The professor is probably a better translation of that. He's a philosophy professor, and he's saying, examine your life. Examine your days. Think about what life is all about. Step back. Think about the totality of your life. And here's what he says, which some of you have friends who brought you to church today, and they're like, we love this church, you should come. And I'm going to read this, and you're going to look at your friend and say, why do you love this church? Don't worry, it gets better, at least I think it gets better. Okay, Ecclesiastes chapter 1, starting in verse 1. This is Solomon. Meaningless, meaningless, says the teacher, utterly meaningless. Everything is meaningless. Fleeting, mist, vapor. What do people gain from all their labors? You go to college, you get a job. What do people gain from all of their labors in which they toil under the sun? And that phrase, under the sun, is a reference to Sagan, to Hawking. Let's assume the cosmos is all there is. Under the sun, what do people gain from all of their labors? And there's a couple words there that are sort of key to understand what Solomon is trying to get you to see. The first word is the word gain. What do people gain? What's the profit? What's the benefit? Whether you're a Christian or not, you are hardwired to ask this question about anything in life. What's the purpose? What's the gain? Why am I doing this? You probably remember doing this in math class when you were in middle school or high school. Why are we doing this? And you're like, I'll use a calculator. Why do I need to know this? And what did people tell you? What did your teacher or your parents tell you? One day, you're not going to have a calculator on you, which isn't true. All of you currently have a calculator on your phone. So it was meaningless. But you're hardwired to ask that question. But anyway, what's the purpose to this? My kids ask that. I need you to walk the dog. Why? What's the purpose? Are you going to give me $1? What's the benefit? What's the gain? If your boss came to you and said, look, I need you to transfer to the San Francisco. Why? What's the benefit? What's the profit? What's the salary increase I get if I do that? You ask this about anything in life. And Solomon says, look, you need to ask this about, the first word is the word gain. That's the key word. The second is all of your life. What's the gain of all of your life? And most of us would say, look, Solomon, in the modern world, I share your premise that under the sun, Sagan's right. In the modern world, the default position, our origins are mysterious. Maybe there's a God, maybe there's not. Our destiny, probably annihilation. Who could really know? Maybe there's a God, who knows? I share your premise. This is all there is. Let's assume that. But I don't share your despair, Solomon. I don't think it's all meaningless. Most people would say, you can't live that way. You need to be optimistic. And most people would say, look, I go to work and I find fulfillment. That's my meaning. I find a sense of purpose in what I do for a living. Or, you know what, I went to dinner last Friday with a friend. I found fulfillment in that conversation. Or when I'm with my kids on vacation, I find fulfillment. Don't tell me life is meaningless. I share your premise. This is all there is, but I do not share your despair, Solomon. To which Solomon would look at you with a pessimistic grin and he would say, you're not thinking hard enough. You're not being honest. To come to that conclusion, you have had to break life into bits and pieces, days and months, and you can find meaning in the day. I had dinner with a friend and I found meaning that day. I took a walk. It gave me a sense of meaning when I took that walk and I sort of looked out. I went to work and I accomplished a task. I found fulfillment in accomplishing that task. To stay sane, you have to break life into bits and pieces. And Solomon's saying, step back, look at the whole of your life. You do this about anything else, you'd ask, what's the gain? And if you look at the moment you're born to the moment you die, under the sun, if this is all there is, what's the purpose? What did you gain? You're not honest enough to do that. He would press you to say, think about all of it. What's the purpose? Meaningless. He doubles down on this in chapter 2. You read it here, starting in verse 21. He says, for a person may labor with wisdom, knowledge, and skill. In other words, you go to college, you get a master's, you get a job at the company, you do well for yourself, you accomplish what you want to accomplish. And then he says they must leave all they own to another who has not toiled for it. A reference to your children. Some of you are like, Dad, don't take notes. This too is meaningless, he says, and a great misfortune. Which you would say, no, it's not. That's exactly why I worked so hard, because I wanted to be able to do this. He said, no, it's a great misfortune. This too is meaningless and a great misfortune. What do people get in this word over and over again? What do people get for all? He says, you can't break life into the bits and pieces. You have to step back. Look at all of life. The moment you're born to the moment you die. If this is all there is, if Sagan is right, if the cosmos is all that is, all that ever was, all that ever will be, what do people get for all their toil, all their work, all their anxious striving with which they labor under the sun, the key word for what he's talking about. This is all there is. All their days, their work is grief and pain. And it's amazing how well he predicts the modern world. Even at night, their minds do not rest unless they take some Ambien. This too, he says, is meaningless. Think about your life. Examine it. You do this with anything. Think about, if this is all there is, think philosophically about your days. And you would say, well, Solomon, I'm not that pessimistic. I don't share that pessimism that you have, that it's all meaningless. I find fulfillment in a vacation that I took. To which Solomon would look at you and say, come on, be honest. Why do you take the vacation? You would say, well, I need the vacation because I work so hard and I feel better when I take a vacation. Why do you need the vacation? Well, because you work so hard. Well, you might say, well, I need to work because it gives me money to do the things that I love to do. I have hobbies. To which Solomon say, well, why do you have hobbies? Well, they recharge my batteries. Well, why are your batteries low? Well, because I work so hard. So do you see what he's doing here? He's pressing you to say, look, you are going through life like a dog chasing its tail. It's meaningless. What is the point? If this is all there is, and you would do this about a meeting coming up on Monday, you would ask, what's the point? What's the gain? Why am I doing this? Do it with your life. Have the guts to do it when it comes to your life. What's the point? And here's what he's doing, if we're really honest, which, why not? We're already here. You have to ask this question. How do you know your life is not stupid? Whether you're a Christian or not, you have to ask this question. How do you know that your life is not just random, who cares, at the end of it all, it didn't really matter anyway? How do you know your life isn't stupid? He's trying to get you. It actually gets worse before it gets better, so hang with me. There is some silver lining coming to this storm cloud. But he says not only is there no meaning to life, if life under the sun is all there is, he continues to walk down this trail. He says, actually, there's not only is there no meaning, there's no justice in the world. Notice what he says here in chapter 2, starting in verse 14. If you're new with us, welcome to our church. He says, the wise have eyes in their heads, while the fool walks in darkness. But I came to realize, in other words, and he wrote a whole book on wisdom, by the way, called Proverbs. But I came to realize the path of the wise, the path of the fool. What does he say? That the same fate overtakes them both. Go ahead, be wise. What does it matter? You get the same fate as the person who flushed their life down the toilet and didn't care at all. There's no justice in the world. You look at the grand scope of history. Take the 20th century, for example. You take the epitome of wisdom, Martin Luther King, some of the luminaries of the 20th century. Martin Luther King Jr., probably the most classic example, fights for what's right. We all would say that's what you should care about. You should be a person who fights for equal rights. You should be a person who cares about racial inequality. That was a great cause. You take the worst case of the 20th century, Adolf Hitler, the epitome of evil, the epitome of foolishness. Solomon would step back from this and he would say, at the end of the day, didn't the same fate overtake both of them? Where is the justice in that? At the end of the day, they both died. Choose wisdom, fine. Choose foolishness. There's no justice to either side that you pick. And you may step back and say, no, I get justice in life. Somebody cuts me off in traffic. Within 5 minutes, I have cut them off back. I speed up beyond the speed limit. I break the law to bring justice, ironically. But I care about justice. And Solomon said, you get justice for today, but you look at the grand scope of history, there is no justice. The cover of USA Today this morning had an article that said that in America, children that have dyslexia, if kids come from wealthy families, they get help. If they come from poor families, they don't get help. That has to drive you insane. There is no justice to the world. Take your own life. You probably earned a living or earn a living, and you did well, or you are currently trying to figure out how to do well and save money. And it's because you were born, when you were born, with the skills that you have, that you are able to do that. If you were born on a mountain in the 9th century in Tibet, you be in poverty. Where's the justice to that? You step back and you look at the scope of history. There's no He's essentially saying, if we're honest, life is a grand crapshoot. How do you make any meaning or justice to any of this? Okay, we need to turn the car around fast because there's a lot of despair. To do that, the best thing to do is always to read C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis, in his book, Encounters with Light, he asks a question that when you think about it in light of Ecclesiastes, it starts to turn towards hope, which Solomon does in the very next chapter. But here's what Lewis said in Encounters with Light. He said, how could an idiotic universe have produced creatures whose mere dreams are so much stronger, better, subtler than itself? Let's phrase it this way. How could a universe where there is no meaning and there is no justice, if this is all there is, produce you, who I would imagine, whether you are a Christian or not, you crave meaning and justice all day long, don't you? And he's essentially saying, how could a universe where the default position, it was a pinprick in the cosmos, 13 billion years ago, explosion of atoms, we all just kind of ended up here, it's random. How could that have produced creatures who long for meaning, who long for justice? It doesn't matter what you do in your life. It doesn't matter what religion you take up. It doesn't matter if you're agnostic, atheist. You go through life wanting to find meaning with your life. You want to see justice everywhere. Every time you turn on the television, it doesn't matter what station you watch, anything that's showing you the news, it's somebody looking for justice in politics or a scandal in baseball. We've got to find justice. And it's not because people are spiritual. It's because we are hardwired to crave and to go after meaning and justice. We live, I would say currently, it's a vulture culture. Anytime anybody does something wrong, we want today for there to be justice in that circumstance. Why is it, Lewis says, that we crave those things when the universe itself doesn't seem to have any of those elements, if it's all just idiotic and random? And what you have from Solomon is an answer, a crystal clear answer, why you crave meaning and justice, why everybody craves meaning and justice, whether you have ever been to church before or not. And this is what he says, Ecclesiastes chapter 3, starting in verse 10. He says, I have seen the burden God has laid on the human race, which that was the last 15 minutes. That was the burden. He says, I have seen the burden God has laid on the human race. He's articulated it. And when he says God, in the book of Ecclesiastes, that's a code word for let's go beyond the sun, the uncreated God, the hand of God. There's several phrases he uses. God himself, this God has created this world. That's the assertion. There's two paths. You could either assume that life under the sun is all there is, or there is a God who has created all things. He says, I have seen the burden God has laid on life under the sun. But he says this, and this is the turn. He has made everything beautiful in its time. And this is really the key. He has also set, what's the word? Set. Let's say it one more time. He has also set eternity in the human heart. No one can fathom what God has done from beginning to end. And it sounds like what he says next is just kind of random and he's pontificating, but there's very specific reason to this. We'll come back to it. You go to verse 15. Whatever is has already been, and whatever will be has been before. And God will call the past to account. And I saw something else under the sun. So he's saying, let's step back into the assumption that Sagan makes. The cosmos is all there is. He says, if that's true, in the place of judgment or justice, wickedness was there. In the place of justice, wickedness was there. I said to myself, God, let's go back beyond the sun to the uncreated God. We'll bring into judgment both the righteous and the wicked. But he starts with this idea. You have eternity set into your heart. What does that mean? That sounds like a nice plaque your grandmother would hang on the wall. You have eternity, something they sell at a Cracker Barrel. Eternity set in your heart. What does that mean? It's the reason why, whether you have ever been to church before or not, whether you've ever prayed before or not, there is a divine whisper constantly in your soul when you put your feet on the floor in the morning that says your choices today matter. Your character matters. How you raise your kids matter. How you treat your coworkers matter. Justice matters. Beauty matters. You can't, nobody can get themselves to the point that Solomon's taking you here to say, if there is no God, pure annihilation and anarchy. Nobody can do that. This is the reason, because eternity is set in your heart. The uncreated God has put something into your created body called eternity. It's this sense that things in this life actually matter, that life is not idiotic, it's not random, it's not just a crapshoot, that there's actually a purpose to this. And whether you believe in God or not, eternity has been set in every human heart. This is the reason why agnostics, people who say, I don't know if there's a God, are optimistic at the end of the day. This is the reason why atheists are humanistic. Some of the best people you will ever meet are atheists. They don't believe in a God because eternity, Solomon says, has been set. Divine dust is in the human heart. And you can't turn that off. It's there. It's constantly an element of the uncreated God has been placed into your created body. This word eternity is this word ha-olam. Ha-olam. In fact, let's say that word together. Ha-olam on the count of three. 1, 2, 3. Ha-olam. And it's essentially this idea, and these are the two paths. If the created world is all there is, we said this in week 1, well, it's all havel is the word. It's all mist. It's all vapor. You could think of it this way. There is an arc to your mind, to your intellect. You're born into the world. You start to learn some stuff. Depending on, your job, career path, whatever it is, college, high school, you gain information, you become intellectual at a certain level, you gain information, but there is an arc to your mind. What begins to happen? Yeah, you don't even remember. See, it's already happening. It all just, well, there she goes. Yeah, it all fades. There is an arc to your body. You are born into this world. You grow up. You play water polo. You whatever. You get older, and all of a sudden, what begins to happen? Yeah, sunspots begin to set in. Hair begins to turn gray. In some cases, hair begins to, just fade. Just go. It's nobody's pointing, okay? But there is an arc to that. There's an arc to your heart. There's an arc to your mind. There's an arc to your body. Solomon says, something uncreated, the opposite of this, something eternal, has been set inside of your Havel body, something that Ha'olam has been placed inside of you. Eternity has been set inside of you. Some part of you that 1 billion years from now and 1 billion years from then will still be there. The most important part of you, your heart, Solomon says, the soul, the scriptures say, Ha'olam has been set in you. And the art to enjoying anything is beginning to look at it, chase it, go after it, the eternal aspects of life. And you go, well, how do you do that? That sounds nice. How do you live with eternity set in your heart? And this is where it gets really practical. There's a couple of ways. The first, and he tells you, and we're going to read this in a moment, you remind yourself, this is what it means to have eternity set in your heart, that justice gets the last word and beauty gets the last word. Justice gets the last word and beauty gets the last word. What does he say here? And he's being very specific here about what it means to have eternity set in your heart. If you go to verse 15, he says, whatever is has already been, and whatever will be has been before. And God will call, the uncreated God will call the past of this created world to account. What is he talking about? I don't know why this is. But you have this theme in the Old Testament, you have this theme in the New Testament, that God is working and weaving all of human history towards a judgment day. And you hear that, especially if you're skeptical of Christianity, you hear that and you go, well, I don't like that, but it is actually a profound act of mercy. He's weaving all of human history towards some kind of moment where we get judged. That ultimately what God has done is he's chosen in the scriptures to articulate a moral standard which all of human history will be judged according to. And that means that if you've ever been really frustrated because somebody did something to you or you saw something on the news and you go, I cannot believe they got away with that, what the scriptures tell you, no, they did not. That there comes a moment where everything is dragged into the light. And you may hear that and you go, well, I don't like that idea. I like the idea of Jesus as love, but God is judgment. I mean, that is is a terrifying thought. But it's a beautiful thought. It's an eternal thought to remember that. And if you're honest with yourself, you're glad that Judgment Day did not happen in 1995. You're glad it didn't happen in 2001. You're glad it's not happening today. God, the author, the weaver of all of history, this is what it means to live with eternity set in your heart, is moving everything towards a day and moment in time where all people will be judged. And anybody, anything that you ever said, I cannot believe they got away with that. No, they did not. If you have eternity set in your heart, you will know there is a God who is in charge of all things and cares deeply about justice more than you do. And if you forget that, if you remove eternity from your heart, what will begin to happen is somebody will do something to you. Years ago, currently, they gossiped about you, they injured you, they caused you pain. And if you feel justice wasn't served, they got away with it, what will happen? You will become bitter. And you'll go through life and your heart will begin to be hard because I can't believe God would allow, I can't believe that happened. And essentially what you're doing, listen, if you're bitter, the reason you're bitter is because you cannot wait for Judgment Day. You're trying to have it right now. You're trying to make sure that justice and judgment is issued and handed out. And God says, trust a God, an eternal God who will mete out justice in the end. Leave room, as Paul says in Romans, for God to act on your behalf and to demonstrate justice. And if you're bitter right now, it's because you cannot wait for Judgment Day. You're having it right now. Turn on the news every day. We're trying to have we want today to be Judgment Day. In your own heart, in traffic today, you will want today to be Judgment Day. And it will start to make your heart bitter. You put eternity in your heart. All of a sudden, you start to recognize justice has the last word. You know what else happens if you don't live with justice, or eternity in your heart, this perspective of justice, this perspective of Judgment Day? You'll go through life with some moral standard, whether you're a Christian, whether you're not, some moral standard that you cooked up. You could have gotten it from a movie you watched. You could have gotten it from something your mother said and some combination of something you saw in 16 Candle, whatever. You've got some moral standard, and at some point in your life, you'll fail that moral standard. And you'll go through life beating yourself up. I can't believe I failed. Maybe you have a family member who reminds you of that particular failure. And you'll go through life. This is why you need a Judgment Day, because you will go through life beating yourself up. I can't believe I did that. I can't believe I'm a failure. And if you're currently here and you're beating yourself up over something from your past, it's because you cannot wait for Judgment Day. You're having it right now. Listen, you are not qualified to be a judge on TV. I'm not either. You're not qualified to be Judge Mathis. What makes you think you are qualified to be the judge and the jury and the executioner of your own life? You're not. God says, look, I'm the great weaver of history. I'm working all things together for justice. That's what it means to live with eternity in your heart. There's another side to this. He doesn't just say God's going to bring the past into account. That's an eternal perspective. But he also says something else in verse, I think it's 10. It's 11. He says, God has made everything beautiful in his time. He's made everything beautiful in his time. What does that mean? It means he brings meaning to everything in the end. There's something in you. This is everybody in the world. If you've experienced a tragedy, as you all have, if you've experienced painful circumstances, a first marriage, you're still confused about why did that happen? Why did they do that? Something from your childhood, why did I even grow up in that home? There's something in you, whether you are a Christian or not, that wants to redeem, wants to find purpose and meaning from the painful circumstances of your life. My friend Mike Foster, our teaching pastor, he says it this way: we want to turn setbacks into superpowers. We want to do that. And in your lifetime, you should fight to do that. I know many of you, I meet people who they lost a loved one to a drunk driver, and there's something in the human heart that says we cannot waste his death. We have to fight to make sure that doesn't happen to somebody else. We want to find meaning in our painful circumstances. And if you are fortunate in this life, in your 80 to 90 years, or however long you live, you will see your pain redeemed. You will see circumstances in your life made beautiful in your time. But even if you don't, this is an eternal perspective. God is a God who does not waste anything. And even if you see a setback turn to a superpower, even if you see something painful from your life redeemed, it pales in comparison in your 80 to 90 years under the sun to what God is going to do with that in 1,000 years, 1 billion years from now, and 1 trillion years from then. And you will ultimately get a perspective, an eternal perspective that says that happened when I was 17, because 1,000 years from now, I see how God wipes every tear from my eye, how God redeems and restores all things. This is the God, Joel says, who restores what the locust has eaten. He does not leave any pain wasted. He doesn't leave anything on the floor. He uses it all. He makes everything beautiful in its time. And if you live with an eternal perspective, it means you go through life and anything painful that happens, you can say and trust, I don't know if in my lifetime I'm going to see that redeemed. I hope you do. You should work for that. But even if I don't, God will make everything beautiful in its time. You see what Solomon's doing here. He's saying there is justice and there is meaning ultimately in eternity. And you should face every day knowing those two things are true. Justice has the last word. And beauty has the last word. Meaning has the last word. And when you step on the path of the uncreated God, you begin to trust that he is weaving and working all things to that end. That's what it means to have eternity in your heart. It's not just a nice sort of big, grand statement. You know what else it means? It means there are things in this life that are eternal. That your body today, as a follower of Christ, you are an overlap of the uncreated and the created world. You're an overlap of the ha'olam and the havel. And what that means is you will experience elements to this life. Love, kindness, things that are true, sit at the heart of the moral cosmos. And the more you give yourself to the things of ha'olam, the things kindness, love, mercy, things that are not just mist and fleeting. The art to enjoying anything is to look for the strand of glory that is always there, kindness. There's always an opportunity to experience the eternal. What does Paul say in 1 Corinthians 13? Faith, hope, and love, these three remain. They do not die. 1 billion years from now, they will still be there. Live your life now for those things that are eternal, the things that you can actually hold on to, and you know they are always there. These things remain: faith, hope, love, kindness, mercy, an act of taking your neighbor's garbage can back to their driveway when they've left it on the street for 15 days. It's eternal. It's eternal when you do that. Kindness matters. It actually lasts. You see what Solomon does here? He does a sharp hairpin turn to say everything matters and everything you do, ha'olam, it's eternal. Justice, beauty, you should live knowing those things are true. John, we're going to take the elements of communion in just a few moments, but I want you to see how these themes are there in the Gospels. John says this about Jesus coming into the world. You probably have seen this verse at some point. Maybe it was just on a sign at a football game, but this is John 3:16. For God so loved the world, the uncreated God loved the created world so much that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish, which means ever, by the way, but have, what's the word? Eternal life. What does that mean? When you hear that, you go, well, that sounds nice. I will live forever. It means justice and beauty are always yours. And you can face every day. You face tomorrow. You face the next day. Constantly aware. This is eternity set in your heart. Eternal life given to you through the person of Jesus Christ. Every day. So we're going to take the elements of communion together from the left side of your aisle. If for some reason you can't stand, raise your hand. One of our ushers would love to bring these elements to you. Ushers, would you come at this time? And as we take these elements, where do you need eternity in your heart today? Where do you need this eternal life to be present for you? Maybe for you today, there's somebody, you can't wait for Judgment Day. You're trying to have it right now. And to live with eternity in your heart means you'd leave room for God. You trust justice to the God of all history. Maybe you're in a circumstance and you're not quite sure why. You're not quite sure how. It's foggy. It doesn't make sense. There's mud on the windshield. You're frustrated. You're confused. And to come and take the elements for you today is an act of trust to say, Jesus Christ, the eternal God, I know, I believe you make everything beautiful in its time. And this confusion, this frustration, you make everything beautiful in its time. Let's take the elements of communion together, and as we do, give gratitude for the eternal God. Grace and peace.